a book, which most of you will have read, called The Stripping of the Altars by Eamon Duffy. And this led to an in-depth reading of what had happened in England in the 16th century, because I was brought up to think England accepted the Reformation. This revisionist reading of history says, on the contrary, it did not. So I read Eamon Duffy, my Catholic Hackles, rose at the story he was telling. Then Alexandra Walsham, Patrick Collinson, Christopher Haig, Alison Patterson, Jack Scarisbrick. Then John Lingard, the great neglected historian, 19th century historian. William Cobbett's History of the Protestant Reformation. Absolutely thrilling read. Cobbett was a Protestant but indignant at the misreading of history, of 16th century history. And to my amazement, when I got to the end of this, I realized that, to use the words of John Guy, the history of the 16th century is nothing more or less but a cover-up, a story written by the winners being William and Robert Cecil and those who profited from the Reformation. And if we just cast our minds back to what Peter Holland was talking about, he perpetuates, without any criticism, the version of the Reformation that has been handed down to us by the Cecils since the time of the Cecils. Now, a quick summary of the way the revisionist version differs from the great myth of Gloriana, the tolerant queen, the queen who never made windows into men's souls. At the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, Catholics were not a minority, they were in the majority. In fact, even A.L. Rouse, who is the kind of historian that Peter Holland bases his lecture on, even Rouse says Catholics were in the majority, but they did not matter, says Rouse, pugnacious Protestant. Philippa Gregory, I noticed from the bookstores in stations and airports here, is a very popular novelist. She writes about the Tudor period. She has brought hook, line and sinker this line. She always says that Elizabeth ascended the throne and she had this problem of equally balanced Protestant and Catholic. Not the case. So the great concealed fact is Catholic numbers. A very recent book that's come out by Michael Kestier, which I thoroughly recommend for an oddly hilarious read, thick book called An English Catholic Community. And it lifts the lid on the way many people then adopted Protestant camouflage but continued their own religion. And Michael Kestier says, yes, what we know about the Catholic resistance then is just the tip of the iceberg. Catholicism was a major problem right through the 17th century. Secondly, the Anglicanism. If I was talking to an English audience here, I would have been a little bit more careful, and I would spend more time on this section, because the English tend to read back the modern Anglican Church, or the Anglican Church they know, going back even to George Herbert, a tolerant, broad church. They read that back into the time of Shakespeare. Now, this is wrong. The religion that came in the wake of Henry's Reformation was Calvinism, a Calvinism that was much more extreme than the Lutheranism in Europe. Luther didn't destroy beautiful objects, wasn't iconoclastic, but these extreme Calvinists brought iconoclasm to England so successfully that if you look for a book on English medieval art in the Metropolitan Museum at New York, you'll find it doesn't exist, because there isn't any. And yet English medieval art was the glory of Europe. We exported from England wonderful alabasters. Just occasionally you see them. I saw one the other day in Ferrara, the most beautiful alabaster. We were famous for that. None survive. There's one English stone statue, as you go, limestone, as you go into the Met at the front, but the face is sliced off of Our Lady and the Child Jesus. So it was a very virulent and vicious form of Calvinism. Yes, this introduction of the Reformed religion is always vindicated by the English because it brought with it the Bible in English, and rightly so. In fact, the English had the Bible in English, but under the counter for some time. But it was right, the Reformers had been pressing for this. But the cost that was paid, spiritually and politically, for the Bible in English was enormous. One of the payoffs was a great threat to authority, because Calvinism, as you know, pronounced that every man was his own priest. And before long, the monarch discovered that a Pandora's box had been opened, and the problems of the Puritans began. Propaganda. This also is underestimated. Propaganda at the period, well, we have nothing to teach them about spin. William Cecil was a master of propaganda. He had read his Machiavelli, and he knew how to operate it. The Protestant historian Dermot McCulloch makes no bones about the shameless spin and chicanery that went on to get the Reformation through. And the law. William Cecil used not coercion, but the law to exclude Catholics from public life little by little. Little by little, Sero sed serio, was in fact William Cecil's motto, slowly but surely, and that was the way he went about introducing the new order. And he had help from the Pope, because the papal bull, Regnans, came in exonerating Catholics in the early 1570s from their allegiance to the Queen. Effectively, this bull branded all Catholics as traitors. Now, the Pope had a reason for doing this. The bull should have come in just before the 1569 rebellion. He knew this was coming, a great rebellion of the North against the Queen, and he wanted to give these rebels carte blanche to remove their leader. But it came in afterwards, and this was absolutely disastrous. And of course it gave a wonderful advantage to William Cecil. Now he could blame Catholics, he could say that they were alien, that they were Romish, that they were Spanish. How did he manage to do the massive task of uprooting the native religion? He introduced an oath which was essential for any public office. To become a JP, an MP, to take your degree, you had to take the oath of supremacy, which explicitly accepted the English monarch as temporal and as spiritual leader. So the oath of supremacy was something a Catholic could not take, and tens of thousands of Catholics chose either to go to prison or to go abroad rather than to take this oath. Now, monthly attendance at communion was enforced by law. If you refused to go to communion, you had to pay a fine of £20. Now, it doesn't sound much to us, but £20 was the annual salary then of a grammar school teacher. So if you, for whatever reason, refused to go to the state church, you had to pay, well, in England it would be £15,000. And if you didn't pay that, then you were sent to prison and 2/3 of your property was confiscated, 2/3 of your property. And as time went on, you were then confined to within 10 miles of your own home. So many, many people refused. New jails had to be built all over the country to house these recusants. And the Canada State Papers are full of complaints from justices of the peace at the amount of prisoners they had to handle. There were constant raids to induce terror and to uncover priests or popish trish-trash. And these raids were in the hands of thugs who paid themselves out of what they found in the houses that they raided. And John Donne, in one of his satires, talks about this, how persecutants will come bursting into your house and say, I like that glass, I'm going to call it a chalice. I like your coat, I think it's a cope. And so that was the sort of harassment that was suddenly unleashed all over the country. It was privatised. Another form of privatisation was that wealthy papists could be handed over by the monarch to a deserving courtier. So the courtier, instead of getting, say, £20 a year from the Queen, could have his papist, his or her papist. And the papist was, the Catholic was milked like a cow. And that courtier would enforce the payment of fines from the papist. So that wouldn't show up in the records of the time. And yet, having laboured through this, which some of you may well know, the Reformation was still resisted for 70 years. There was an obstinate grassroots dislike of a religion based on the letter, not on the visual. Patrick Collinson, who a Protestant historian, describes the changeover under Henry as being like a range of mountains. Before this range, the far side, the medieval side, is an integrated culture, the religious and the secular interpenetrating each other. And afterwards, a separation of the two, which we feel to this day, secular on the one side, religion on the other, the disassociation of sensibility, which Eliot pinpointed so accurately. And the scholar Alexandra Walsham gives a marvellous picture of a nation which sullenly went to church, feeling that it was perjured in doing so, doing everything possible to be there simply in body, not in spirit, blocking their ears, folding their arms, looking the other way, drowning the parson's saw. Building box pews, I think, started at this point, which again separated you off from the service. There's one pew, incidentally, in Yorkshire, which is a very recusant county, and the local family, the Cholmondeleys, built their pew, family pew, above the pulpit and behind it, up there. So imagine being the poor vicar with all his family looking down. Definitely a sort of intimidating thing to do. Why didn't England... Here we have the great medieval ship going down. Why didn't England, if it valued it, protest? Well, it's a huge question, and there's several reasons. One, a lot of the country had its hand in the till. The great release of money from the dissolution of the monasteries, that money all fell into private hands. If you went back to the old ways, it looked like you might lose your manor house. A lot of people didn't want to do that. Preferred to take the risk and die with a priest on hand. Secondly, anyone who looked like being a Catholic figurehead was very neatly picked off by the regime. Thirdly, the Queen played the game very cleverly that she might just marry a Catholic. And so the Catholics always led to, well, next year, well, there's a rumour, well, she might, or else her heir will be a Catholic. King James is definitely going to be Catholic, married to a Catholic. She played that game very well. And then, lastly, invasion. Rebellion seemed to be a treacherous and terrible thing to do, particularly with the memory of the Wars of the Roses behind. But invasion, what if the superpower came to the aid of England? There's almost an Iraq situation here. What if Spain invaded? This would be the ideal solution. Then you could rise up Spain lands with the English exiles in the fore, and you go and join them. This, in brief, is the national malaise which is omitted from Shakespeare studies, completely overlooked in Shakespeare commentaries, and yet key to Shakespeare's audience. So important, such a huge piece of material, I would call it the elephant in the room. England was in a uniquely complex predicament. Think about it. Double-crossed in a way by the papacy, let down by the government. It was an age of utter belief, where you believed if you didn't go to Mass, if you didn't live your religion, you went to hell. And there was also the deep love evident in the spirituality of the art and literature that survives from the Middle Ages, the deep spirituality that characterised England at that point. Now here we come to the literature, so much for the history. Holland talks about the widespread censorship of the day. He might ask himself why, if Elizabeth was such a tolerant queen, there was any need of widespread censorship. Anyway, he says there was widespread censorship. Now, we're discovering more and more about this censorship. Greg Walker, which I thoroughly recommend, has just produced a book called Writing Under Tyranny. And this book shines a spotlight on the moment when Henry VIII turned from textbook humanist prince to a classic case of tyranny, a tyrant. Now, this happened almost overnight. And what Greg Walker looks at is what happened to literature. Just before this happened, in this ideal humanist court, the writers were advisors to the monarch. and their plays advised the monarch. They conversed among themselves. They talked about religion, politics, and so on. Immediately afterwards, the nature of literature changed. Suddenly they're writing private sonnets. It becomes internalized, conflicted, anguished, and dark. If you look at the work of Wyatt and Surrey in the light of this, suddenly you begin to see the roots of modern English literature as atomized and individualistic, rather than the communal literature beforehand. Now, of course, at first, self-censorship was the obvious route. If you didn't self-censor, you were in deep trouble. But before long, the law came in, and the inflammatory subjects of religion and politics were forbidden on stage. And yet religion and politics were the staple subjects of drama before the Reformation. Now, the effect of this censorship, according to Walter Raleigh, was the increase of wit, exactly as in Soviet Eastern Europe. And Alison Patterson describes 16th century literature from Wyatt and Surrey onwards as a way around censorship. It's very strong words. It was conceived as a way around censorship. Peter Holland, I'm surprised, does not seem to have read or doesn't take on board the work of Alison Patterson, who demonstrates the way censorship worked at this point. Richard Dutton and David Bevington are other scholars who talk about this, and who describe the very complex way censorship worked. How do you censor the majority opposition? Because that was what was being censored, not the occasional reference to France or to Lord Cobham. What was being censored was nothing less than the majority opposition. Well, it worked this way. It was a bit good cop, bad cop. You had, first of all, the Ecclesiastical Court of High Commission, which was the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Bishop of London. These were driven men who were determined to push the Reformation through. Now, by 1586, they'd taken on the massive task of censoring all literature, including play texts. Of course, they'd reduced that task slightly, or enormously, by banning amateur drama. But they had a big problem, and that was manpower. They hadn't really even got enough manpower to fill their parishes. There was constant lament, how do you get these clerics for the new religion? But to get enough people in the City of London to vet the kind of literature and the plays that were being written was almost impossible. And I think that this was exploited by writers at the time by the simple expedient of length, enormous length. You know how long The Faerie Queen and Arcadia are. And buried in the heart of these works are often very subversive things. And there were time-honoured techniques within this literature, which Alison Patterson goes into. And these techniques were allowed through by the second censor. This was Edmund Tilney, who was Master of the Revels. He was employed by William Howard, Lord Chamberlain, when Elizabeth came to the throne. And so he was a Howard protégé. And Edmund Tilney, his concern was not to ease through the reforms, it was to entertain the court. Now, the court was very largely crypto-Catholic, and it was to entertain the Queen, and the Queen wanted to know what was going on. So Edmund Tilney wanted good quality stuff. He had a very largely crypto-Catholic audience, and he himself had Catholic links. His nephew was one of the Babington plotters. He was executed, allegedly, for planning to assassinate the Queen. Now, the fact that the censor was hand in glove with the writers is something which Peter Holland doesn't address. And what was happening here was a great and very complex game. You could say anything about religion and politics, provided you said it deniably. We've known for some time, that quite a lot of Protestant commentary on religion and politics has got through. But we miss the Catholic commentary, because we don't actually know what they're saying. But what are these techniques that they used, the censor and the censored? Well, the first one was to use the kind of terms that Protestants used for the Queen, but to turn them on their head. The Queen was the moon, for instance. But the moon only shines at night. So it was one step from praising the moon to saying the moon only shines in a benighted place. And it's interesting to look at how many people wrote about the feeling of being in the night. Chapman, who we don't understand at all, writes about the night, the misery of night. The centre of the Faerie Queen is an outcry against the night. And Shakespeare often brings this up. There were other terms like this. Troy meant England. This was a very useful cover for England, because one of the survivors from the sack of Troy was supposed to have come to England and founded London. And so London was called Troy Novant, or New Troy. Now, anything about Troy automatically had a secondary possible meaning that it was about England. This makes a place like Troilus and Cressida look rather different. Rome, same thing. Nothing could be easier than to talk about ancient Rome, but just to use a few words to flip it forward to Catholic Rome. Tempest. The tempest was a term used by everybody, the tempest of the times, referring to the Reformation, rather like the Blitz and Prohibition. You didn't need anything to qualify that. Finally, what were they talking about? We do have an access to the terms that were being used. There are Jesuit plays written by Jesuits in exile that have been unpacked by Alison Schell. And one of them is just to give an example of the way exiles looked at what was happening in their country. England is asleep. She is called Psyche. Her children are the heretics, the Catholics, and the Catholic exiles. These three want to wake England from her sleep. And they know that there is something that can wake England, and this is a rose that blooms in peacedom. They go off to get the rose to wake England, but they fall out, they all quarrel with each other. and philosophy has to come in at the end and solves this quarrel. Now, this very simple little tale suddenly throws light on the identities that might be hiding behind the literature of the period. Walking on the stage, we can have England, we can have sanctity, we can have Genevan religion, we can have the Catholic religion, truth walking on the stage, heretics. There's a poem by Thomas Lodge at this period called Truth's Lament over England. And truth spreads her wings and leaves England and says, "You islanders, adieu, you banished me before I fled from you." This is a very fundamental concept to the literature of the age, the fact that truth, which is often a double truth, the Reformed truth and the Catholic truth, has fled from England. So we have to really get ourselves back into this mindset, into this way, almost like a modern political cartoon, this way of looking at the problems and what's going on. Another way they played the game was by using very obvious parallels in love poetry. For instance, instead of saying my love, you say my faith. Instead of saying my heart, you say my soul. And automatically a love poem takes one step sideways into a poem about religion and politics. Here's one poet saying to his love, "Don't be cruel to me. Kill rebels proudly that resist, not those that in true faith persist." Now, this is another typical trick to turn something to the plural. Shakespeare often does this. A single person becomes plural. Kill rebels proudly that resist. Certainly kill seditious rebels, not those that in true faith persist. And immediately you get a political plea. Sidney, among many others, gives a little nudge to us. He says, "Under the pretty tales of wolves and sheep are whole considerations of wrongdoing and patience." Wrongdoing and patience. Exactly the concerns that afflicted England at this point. Johnson, in his Bartholomew Fair, gives a very clear picture of the kind of censorship that went on as time went on after about 1612. This is after Shakespeare's retired. And Bartholomew Fair, he starts off on his play, the stage, ready, onto the stage, comes a minor character, says, "Oh, play's not ready yet, the author isn't around yet. Just to let you know, rather as you might say, turn off your cell phones," he says, "if there are any picklocks, politic picklocks or state decipherers in the audience, they can leave." That is absolutely takes on back to the Soviet Union when you had the KGB standing around. Any state decipherers, off you go. Then she says, "Oh, no, don't bother. You don't need to go. I've just realised this play is completely clean. Nothing wrong with it. You won't find anything wrong with this play. Not like some people. Not like people who talk about servant monsters and tempests and statesmen concealed behind mousetraps." Now, this is unmistakable allusion to Shakespeare. And he says, "Oh, my man, he's not going to do that. He's sensible. He doesn't want to mix his head with other men's heels." Now, I don't know why this has been passed over so often, but to mix your head with other men's heels means to be beaten up. And it's not the first time that Johnson talks about the playwright being beaten up. He says, playwright, little tiny poem on a playwright. He says, "Playwright, convict of public wrongs to men, takes private beatings and begins again." So what he's talking about is hired thugs around the back of the theatre. Now, Shakespeare also talks, like Sidney and like all the others, about double vision in his work. In Sonnet 24, he says, "Through the artist you must see his skill to find where your true image pictured lies." And he's talking about perspective. He's talking about trompe l'oeil. You probably know the picture by Holbein, The Ambassadors, in the front of which is a skull. The artist must show you where to stand so that the skull slips into the right perspective and you see it as a skull. This is called perspective in Shakespeare's day. Shakespeare often brings this up, this form of double vision. This is the way he's writing. Perspective, he says, is the best form of art in Sonnet 24. And I think this is the key, that after 40 years of shadowed literature, of complex literature, written by Farrant, Edwards, Lilly, all court playwrights, all Catholics, all predecessors of Shakespeare, literature, this shadowed literature, reaches its most refined point in Shakespeare. Now, I said that I would go back to those three extracts at the beginning of the lecture. The first is the pit. Now, the pit, the very word, would have conjured up something that everybody knew about at the time. The building that Shakespeare mentions more often than any other is the Tower of London in his work. And there was a list of horrors that went on in the Tower of London that did the rounds. The Scavenger's Daughter was one, horrible form of torture where you were crushed within a metal wheel. The rack, obviously, famous. But there was another one, which was the pit. This was a well shaft, 20 feet deep, into which prisoners, and particularly priests, were thrown. And Robert Southwell describes them licking the moisture from the walls. They were just left there in the damp and the dark, completely pitch dark, and then taken out to be tortured. It was like having Abu Ghraib in the middle of London. People knew this was going on, and yet you couldn't talk about it. And if you rerun all those epithets for the pit in Titus Andronicus, you find they all match this picture of torture going on in the pit in the tower very well indeed. The river of hell, for instance. There's no reason why the pit in the play should be connected with a river, but it does connect with a well shaft. So this isn't just a fleeting reference by Shakespeare, by the way, in Titus Andronicus. These things are like keyholes or flags that flag up a consistent inner meaning. And the reason why Titus is such a difficult play, so odd, so random on the surface, is that what Shakespeare's writing about on the hidden level, and he's quite young when he writes it, obsesses him so much. So the surface gets distorted. He's writing about the reign of terror that comes in at the beginning of the 90s. It's full of horrors, that play, a very indignant play. King John, the French king, torn between his oath to the English king and his oath to the papacy. Well, now you know. Just where we sit back and fold our arms and think, what is Shakespeare on about? This is a moment when his own audience would have sat forward and been gripped. Because what Shakespeare is talking about here, nothing to do with the French king. This was their own situation. And when the French king says, I am perplexed and know not what to say, Shakespeare is giving tongue to what could not be uttered. And the third one, July the 6th. Why July the 6th of all dates? And why look to your consciences? And what are old ends? Well, at the time, the great iconic hero in the 90s, the man who stood up and refused to take the oath, who had plays written about him, was Thomas More. Thomas More was executed on July the 6th. And this date was driven deep into Catholic consciousness because Edward VI, son of Henry VIII, also died on July the 6th sometime after. And this was thought by Catholics, of course, to be a judgment on Henry VIII. So now we see why Benedict says, mock not old ends, he means old deaths. Look to your consciences. And again, he died, of course, for conscience's sake. And that, again, is not just a little mention, a little sort of something to show that he's Catholic. It's an entry point to the whole play. If you remember, Benedict was once in love with Beatrice before the play begins. They had something going. And then they fell apart. And Benedict is light-hearted, he's never going to fall in love. From this moment, Benedict becomes a serious man. And it's an invitation to us to look at the underlying story in this play, which is a very beautiful allegory of what was going on at the time. Highly complicated, sophisticated, and accurate. Now, everyone has known that Shakespeare has certain insistent preoccupations. These could be just parallels, the ones I've described. And there are these parallel preoccupations. Peter Ackroyd, in his long biography of Shakespeare, picks them out as being these. And I agree with Ackroyd. He says Shakespeare, throughout the book, exile is one of his preoccupations. Sympathy with failure, oath-taking, the murder of innocence, the unquiet conscience, disguise, and divided loyalty. Now, they're very interesting parallels, aren't they? Wouldn't they all be precisely the concerns of the English audience at the time? But Ackroyd, deprived of the background I've been telling you about, deprived of that, has to look into Shakespeare's own life. So all this is seen as biographical in what Shakespeare's telling us about himself. And this is the way all Shakespeare biographers work. They don't look at this revisionist history, which mysteriously stays in the history department and not in the English one. And instead, everything is referred to Shakespeare's own life or his own immediate biography. Now, as I've said up to now, it could all just about, except July the 6th, be parallel. Because Shakespeare, if he was playing this game, had to play it deniably, as Lilly did. Lilly, brilliant at saying, in his prefaces, things like, this is a Trojan horse, this play, alerting you to the fact that there must be something hidden inside it. And then saying things like, I'm writing about Dionysus' court, I mean no court but that. You can see the game being played, writing about another tyrant, not the tyranny of Elizabeth. But Shakespeare was different, and this is where I put my head on the block. I think all the people who think that Shakespeare was, and his contemporaries, were writing resistance politics, will probably go along with what I've been saying. But I invite all of you to spend the next year going through Shakespeare's works with this in mind. You can read him quite quickly, the whole lot, more quickly than you think, with this in mind, and see whether it works for you. At the time, if you write about Northern Ireland, and you weren't allowed to do a play about it, how would you do the play? How would you show both sides, Catholic and Protestant? Very simple. You would dress them, wouldn't you, in green and orange. No problem. Now, there were ready-made uniforms for Protestant and Catholic in those days, high and low. This was the way everybody talked about the two churches way back then. And there are poems, Spenser, George Herbert, and Sidney all use these terms. So high and low, those are two ways. Another two ways. Dark, of course, the Puritan, we all recognise, we would dress Malvolio in black. And for Catholic, well, red or fair hair, the Scarlet Woman. Now, Shakespeare is always populist, boils down, in my view, these two ingredients to something very simple. And he uses these terms with incredible delicacy. If you have somebody that is connected with the word high and has fair hair, you are in the Catholic camp. Maybe good, it may be bad, it may be ridiculous, but in cartoon terms, that's where you are. On the other side, if you've got someone connected with the word low and they have dark hair, not skin, then you are in the Protestant camp. Now, this accuracy with which he uses these two allows him, odd enough, an enormously sophisticated range of comment. I'm just going to, have I just picked these randomly out of the air? Try this. The dark and low are surrounded by a penumbra, a sort of cloud of reference, and I'm picking out what these references are. Around the dark and low camp will be these, some or all of these. The North, this is the direct inspiration, rebellion, heresy, dislike of pictures, of portraits, of iconography, chastity, purity, the word Puritan, black ink, the wrong time, and direct inspiration. Now, all those associated with the dark. And on the fair side, fair and high, the South, holiness, idolatry, the word gazing, maypoles, saints' feasts, old customs, cakes and ale, illustrated books, merit rather than grace, enthrallment, self-pity, victimization, ill-treatment, and disguise. And for a very simple version of this, just go to Taming of the Shrew, where you have Bianca, the white, the shrew, who is dark, and a lot of these markers surrounding both of them. This was an early play, very open, almost a cartoon. What is Shakespeare doing with these two? Huge amount, and it changes as time goes on. But consistent is this nostalgia, this longing to get back to the integration of the two before the Reformation. It's seen, for instance, he says, a double cherry seeming parted is one of his many images for the way these two sisters, the dark and the fair sisters, were intertwined originally. One can almost see them as yin and yang before the split, the psychic split of the Reformation. And so, following this lead, I learned an enormous amount. I had to go to history books to check out what Shakespeare was saying. I couldn't believe the following things, which I learned from the plays. First, one of Shakespeare's main concerns was the split within the Catholic resistance. I didn't even know there was one of those. Then you go and read about the appellants, this enormous threat to the resistance. Logical, this always happens in resistance movements. Second, Shakespeare's consistent advice not to rebel. He's against rebellions. But he has many invasions in his plays, and they are all positive events. Extraordinary in a time when England was armed against invasion, when the whole country was on military alert, when a series of armadas were expected, that Shakespeare should only have positive invasions. Really surprising. And yet that ties in with what a majority of the country seem to think: wait for rescue from abroad rather than rebel. If you rebel, you will only make things worse. I, being Catholic, wanted Shakespeare to be nice about Catholics. He's not. He very often is not. He's describing them as much troublemakers as the Puritans. And I'll just give you a second caricature. One is Taming of the Shrew. Another one is, we all know Malvolio is a caricature of a Puritan. But against Malvolio's, Andrew Aguecheek and Toby Belch would have been straight-up caricatures of Catholics at the time, of the extreme old squirearchy, reactionary, and with their house priest, which I think Andrew Aguecheek very much looks like. And there is the little label coming in, because Andrew Aguecheek, remember, has long fair hair as well as red stocking. These little markers, not to be many, they would have needed that one at the time. And then there are beautiful embodiments. Viola, too complex to go into here, but at the other extreme from caricature, an evocation of what it meant to be resistance and a resistance artist in the England of the time. Now, at this point in the lecture, I would usually launch into a play and look at that play, but I've gone on for quite a long time already, and I want to spend a couple of minutes on what Peter Holland put on the table. The first one was that Elizabeth was a tolerant queen. Mysteriously, he says, more tolerant, I think I heard him say on the videotape, more tolerant than modern churches. And that the Jesuits could quite reasonably be seen as terrorists, as the Pope had absolved Catholics in the bull Regnans of their loyalty to the Queen. It wasn't simply Jesuits who'd been absolved of their loyalty to the Queen. It was all Catholics, and Catholics were in the majority. Now, a country where the majority are branded as traitors is a tyranny, in my book. And Shakespeare addresses this problem in the middle of Macbeth, where there are more traitors than honest men. Traitors are the people who swear and lie. There's a little discussion. The tiny boy, little Macduff, says, what are traitors? A traitor is a man who swears and lies. But there are more traitors than honest men. So why don't the traitors turn on them? And his father is a traitor. The traitors are good. So he's looking at a whole country that is terrorist, not simply the Jesuits, Peter Holland. And secondly, he says that Catholics were persecuted for politics, not for religion. Now, William Cecil would have laughed at this, Elizabeth's tolerance here. But I'm going to read out a piece of the body of literature which is criminally neglected. This is the literature written by people who are on the run at the resistance in England or who are abroad. And this is Robert Southwell. And Robert Southwell wrote his humble supplication while he was on the run. It's an appeal to the Queen over the heads of her advisors. This appeal to the Queen is against exactly the accusation that Peter Holland has made, the accusation that Catholics are being persecuted for politics and not religion. He's absolutely indignant at this. And he repeats it again and again in this marvellous piece of rhetoric. These are some of the best pieces of prose written in the period, and yet they're absolutely, they're not read. He said several times, Your Majesty must be informed by these slanderers that we suffer nothing for religion, who in respect only of religion our miseries have been afflicted with misery. He says, what is our recusancy, or refusal to be present at the Protestant service, but a mere matter of conscience? And he says the Protestants would agree. He says, we therefore, not gainsaid in this by Calvin, Melanchthon, or any other learned Protestant, esteem the voluntary presence of any man at the service of a contrary sect a denial of his faith before men, which being by Christ expressly prohibited, cannot but be judged a matter of mere conscience and religion. And then we can see Southwell moving into rather a journalist or a reporter trying to convey to the Queen what it is like on the ground. He says, these are the penalties. This is what's happening to us. He says, first, there are £20 by the month exacted of such as are able to pay it, after the rate of 13 months by the year. They reckon 13 months of the year, an account unusual in all other causes. And multitudes of the unabler sort of Catholics daily feel that all their goods and 2/3 parts of their lands are seized on for their recusancy, that cannot yearly pay 13 score pounds for the same. Yea, and this law has been so violently executed that where poor farmers and husbandmen have but one cow for themselves and many children to live upon, that for their recusancy has been taken from them. And where both cows and cattle were wanting, they have taken their coverlets, sheets, and blankets from their beds, their victuals and poor provision from their houses, not sparing so much as the very glass of their windows when they found nothing else to serve their turns withal.